truthfulness and aliveness. And I think that's what you were talking about feeling, is that like some poems literally have like a vibrating signature, energetic signature. And when we read them, there's something contagious about the mind state that the poet was in, and then what we experience. It's like in dance performance studies, it's called empathetic kinesthetic awareness. It's like we feel each other. The simple way of saying that is we feel each other. And when someone writes a poem that's true, we feel it. And then we're like, have permission to be more just who we are.
Welcome to Learning Horizons, where we explore the future of learning and its role in helping us meet the challenges of our time. I'm Jonas, and in today's episode I am speaking with Brooke McNamara. Brooke is a poet, meditation instructor, and transmitted Zen teacher and lineage holder. She has published 2 books of poems, Bury the Seed and Feed Your Vow. She loves to create poems from 3 main ingredients: the raw material of everyday life, wholehearted and visceral listening, and the mind of meditation. For her poetry, Brooke is the recipient of the Charles B. Palmer Prize from the Academy of American Poets. She has taught at Naropa University in yoga studies and at the University of Colorado, Boulder in dance. Brooke is president and a founding teacher at Dragon Lake Zen and teaches in-person and online courses and retreats to facilitate the awakening of inner wisdom, compassion, artistry, and play. She lives in Boulder, Colorado with her husband Rob and their 2 sons. In this episode, Brooke and I talk about the origins of her passion and work, her teaching of Zen practice and writing, working with emptiness and form, teaching from the edges of emptiness and form in both Zen and creative expression, the art of seeking and letting go, slowing down in moments of collective urgency, and her upcoming work and offerings. I've enjoyed and been inspired by Brooke's work for many years. I really enjoyed this conversation with her, and I think you will too. Here is me talking with Brooke McNamara. Welcome, Brooke. I am so happy to have finally been able to have this opportunity for us to actually have a conversation. It's been a little while in the making, hasn't it?
Yeah, I'm happy to be. We were just reminiscing that it's been over a year of trying to align our schedules and our
Yes,
lives.
lives.
We've done it.
Yes, finally. And
Success.
it is. I thought it'd be nice to start to let people know where we're actually sitting
Hmm.
and coming from as we have the conversation. So I'm actually in Australia it's a small city called Brisbane in Eastern Australia, and it's Yagara and Turrbal country, the traditional custodians here in Australia. And it's a river city, so there's a beautiful river that flows all the way through.
Mm.
And there's a lot of greenery, and it's a beautiful place. So that's where I'm sitting. Whereabouts are you calling in from today?
I'm calling in from Boulder, Colorado, in the
Mm-hmm.
United States, which is kind of west central United States, and it's the traditional territory, the unceded land of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute people.
Mm-hmm.
And we sit in a little valley, Boulder Valley, right along the front range of the Rocky Mountains. So we have this classic kind of view of the Flatirons, which are the front of those mountains. And it's sort of a famous view. It's beautiful. And for me, it's Friday afternoon, and for you, it's early Friday morning, Saturday morning.
Saturday morning. It's the
You're in
weekend. Yes, exactly. I'm in the future. So
you're in my future. Yeah.
yeah. Beautiful. I've been to, as we were talking before starting to record, I have visited Boulder once. I think it might have been 10 years ago now, almost, but went up a walk up, I think it was Flatiron Rock, actually. It's such a beautiful country,
Yeah.
that the fact that you have that at your doorstep, um, is it. I'm assuming here it must be a really well. Instead of assuming, what does the country and the nature around you, how does that um, feed you or impact you in terms of the work that you do?
Mm-hmm. Honestly, lately I've been so busy that I just walk the local trails, and I mean like the trails that are right outside my door. And I live in a little neighborhood where my kids play with other kids, and their school is about 10 minutes away, and downtown is 10 minutes. But there's trails right here that go by a creek. It's like a tributary of Boulder Creek, and there's farmlands that I can get to in like 15 or 20 minutes. So that's where I walk or run. But when I have more free time, there's trails like that are breathtaking,
Yeah.
probably a 15-minute drive. And 2 weeks ago, I got to officiate a wedding for a couple that was eloping, just 15 minutes up in the mountains and a 10-minute walk on a trail to a little historical cabin. And
Mm-hmm.
again and again, I've lived here 12 years, over and over, I'm struck by it's like, feels like the mind of meditation just in the forest. It's just spacious and quiet, and all the sounds are really clear and crisp, and the light is, you know, really soft, especially this time of year in autumn. So when I can get, out my doorstep, it's really nourishing. It's so quiet compared to my loud home of little boys running around, my two sons.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you live in Boulder, Colorado. You've got two sons, um, and while we're going down that path of where you are and what surrounds you, what's in your life, I thought it would be great to start to begin our conversation with a a bit of a origin story of how you find yourself in the present moment in what you
Mhm.
give your life to.
Mhm.
Um, I to in a nutshell for people, you're a poet, you're a teacher, a Zen practitioner, and um, you yeah, I maybe I'll leave it to you to actually describe that story, but I would love to hear that story.
Thank you for asking. It always comes out a little differently and always a little surprisingly, but there are some, you know, constant patterns. I think what strikes me, someone asked on Facebook not too long ago, what did you want to be when you grew up? And I said, oh, I wanted to be a writer, a dancer, and a priestess. I had some kind of a notion of like, maybe not priestess, but I was always in love with, what I might call the holy or the sacred, or I was raised Christian, so I associated it with Jesus. I really was in love with Jesus. I thought he was so amazing. Um, but it was, love. I wanted to be centering my life around this feeling I got standing at the ocean, or praying in church, or sitting in my mom's garden. And now I find myself, I did get a dance career for about 15 years, and I'm retired from that. But now, like you said, I work as a poet, and I teach poetry, and I teach poetry with meditation. For me, they're two sides of one coin. It's like sitting still and listening with my whole body, and then allowing expression to rise up from who knows where. Um, and I find practicing that and teaching that really endlessly fulfilling and fun and tender. Um, And I've been practicing Zen for almost 15 years now, and still a student, of course, and practitioner, and received an empowerment to teach a year and a half ago. So and an empowerment as a priest. So there's certain functions where I feel that priestly or priestess function, and kind of takes my breath away, like, oh, this is what I've always cared the most about. And I can't name what it is, but it's that feeling of connection to the here and now, and to each other, and to the land, like you were invoking,
Mm.
and to all that is. And I find that in so many ways, and everybody finds that in their own unique ways. But I love being with people in the common value and intention of connection. Um, and just to go back to the origin, I think as a child, my embodied memory, even though I had a beautiful childhood, I'm very grateful for. I remember just so much fear, and I was really quiet and shy. And I maybe this is true for lots of kids, although I don't really see it with especially my younger son. It's just he's like happy to be here. And I was not. I wasn't happy to be here. I was not unhappy to be here, but I was completely overwhelmed by whatever adults were doing. I thought adults were so intimidating, and I didn't know how to like speak in a way that I could connect with adults. And I just always felt like put on the spot. Like everything was a little jarring, like, ah.
Yeah.
And but I do remember sitting still in my mom's gardening, and she has memories of my brother running around and of me just sitting totally still for long periods of time. And I remember a sense of peacefulness in that. And I remember writing my first poem when I was around 8, and it was a really serious inquiry for me then. And now it's kind of funny. It was about my pet bird, Bart Cockatiel, who I was really concerned. Did he feel safe because we had him in a cage, or did he feel trapped? And so I wrote a poem about that, and it satisfied something in me to like bring a question from my interior into something out there.
Hmm.
Um, and then dancing was always also a way that I felt peace and happiness, and like this world made sense. So those are the pathways I just have always followed, and they've led to uh, a lot of profundity, and a real joy to be alive on Earth, even though we live in such troubling times.
Yes,
Yeah.
we do. Oh, that's a beautiful story. And yeah, that how we come into the world and how we, um, what our, what's the word I'm looking for? What our, what we're made of, and the way that we sort of kind of arrive. I've heard people who speak of children when they first have them as kind of maybe not arriving fully formed in sort of the seed of who they are. And of course, that would can change and develop, but that in many ways, our disposition, maybe, or the way that we kind of come into the world can be very different. And it sounds like that was the case between
Yeah.
yourself and between one of your sons. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. My two sons have very different kind of essential qualities. And of
Mm,
course, I don't fix them into anything, but yeah, they're their own unique beings, and they're very different from one another. So that's really
yeah,
interesting to watch. Yeah.
it is. And so to kind of set the scene, or to give a frame, I guess, this podcast has recently gone through a change in name, which is a
Hmm.
little bit ironic because the first time we were going to make time to have a conversation, I think it still had the original name, which was called the Name It podcast, um,
Hmm.
which is a little bit long and a little bit not really that clear, but um, it was about naming those things that have yet to have been said and described and understood. And between conversation between people from completely different walks of life, I was really curious as to what could emerge, and as part of that naming, what could then be possible in some way, or what might arise. And that changed recently, where I was realizing that it was around what does it mean to be human in our current world? What is required of us? What is within us and yet to emerge? And how do we ourselves be more in relationship to that in a way that actually serves the relationships, the world that we're a part of, but also the learning and teaching that will happen from one generation to the next, which is a really long circle around to why I just thought of that then. And it's become the learning horizons.
Oh,
And
nice. I like that.
yeah, yeah. So what's emerging? Where are we kind of moving into in terms of, in the broadest sense, intergenerational transfer of knowledge in being human, essentially, and what does that mean? So, hearing you describe your own coming into the world, and also raising two young boys and how they're arriving into the world, and the fact that you are a teacher in a broad respect, across dance, across poetry, across the Zen meditation tradition. I would be curious to hear from you what your experience is around that transmission or teaching, in the broadest sense in your work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such an important and vital inquiry. Um, I used to work with kids a lot, and I don't anymore. Now I work only with adults professionally, but I'm a mom, so I feel like I'm transmitting so much information to my kids and them to me all the time. Um, both intentionally and not intentionally, and both verbally and just in how I move and the moods I have and how I work with the mood, all everything is whatever traumas I haven't resolved or being transmitted. And so it's a strong mirror to be
Mm.
aware of. And for whatever reason, I feel lucky that I don't berate myself and, have to, when I notice myself being hard on myself for not being a mom like she is or whatever, maybe it's the meditation training, but there's instantly a really gentle voice like, you know, you're doing the best you can, and what can you do next? Um, which is also part of creative training and any real training that's going to work. We have to learn how to be kind to ourselves, right? So if my kids learn nothing else, it's like I want them to know that they can make mistakes and that they can take responsibility for them. And in the Zen tradition, we talk about atonement as at one, becoming one with our mistakes, and um, taking right action to apologize and make things right in whatever ways feel like they can do that.
Mm.
So not to avoid like, oh, just, whatever, but for them to be free to be themselves, to make plenty of mistakes in the process. And I think ultimately what I really wish to transmit to my kids and to teach my kids and to also learn from them is freedom and love. Those are the that's the heart of it. And that's the heart of poetry. I majored in poetry in undergrad, but I am not a scholarly writer. I'm not an academic writer. I study just enough to have skills to support liberation and love in poetry. Like that's all I care about. And for the people that are students that again I'm learning from and with, that's what I offer. That if they want a more academic approach, I recommend other teachers. But what I'm hunting for and sniffing out is where's the aliveness and where's the freedom and how can we risk and play and fall down and get up and take another risk and laugh and cry and ultimately feel just the tender love that we are made of and the freedom to express that in whatever our voice is. So um that's the heart of it all. That's what I want to transmit. And there's probably more details I could add, but I'll pause there.
Yeah. I there's that there's that sort of distinction, perhaps. Maybe it's not very solid at all, but there's just the being human that we are doing all the time with the people in our lives, with the people that we love, the people we want to relate with, the people we relate with because we're in the same space, and the transmission that can happen from that, especially in the moments when we are just fumbling or making mistakes.
Yeah.
And then there's, in some respect, those maybe the roles that we step into or that we are more conscious about, where we, whether that's leading a meditation class or poetry, as you were talking about before, or whatever someone's sort of more formal teaching role might be. And
Right.
and yet within all of that, as I kind of was hearing you say, it's that transmission is always happening. It's always
Yeah.
already happening anyway. And that for you, it's that at the core of all of it is about love and freedom. And yeah, so I thought that was a really beautiful way to frame that. And I wonder, in terms of meditation and that kind of space, there's some terminology that sometimes gets used, and I'm far from an experienced practitioner, so people can forgive me for this, but there's the idea of both form and formlessness, with formless being, well, if I start to use words, it already might take us in a different direction, but it's there's the spacious opening in which all of life and everything else arises. And there's form, there's life, there's the gritty parts, the beautiful parts. And I wonder how, so we just talked about transmission, perhaps just in living, that sort of unconscious, unintentional transmitting and learning from others and them learning from us. And I wanted to perhaps invite another dynamic, which is between form and formlessness, and how that shows up in your perhaps your meditation practice to start with. Perhaps that's more of a direct pathway in. And to be more specific, in your role, which is to, you might describe it better than I can, but to walk with people as they begin their meditation practice, which includes both form and formlessness. what's your experience in helping to work with people with those two sides of that coin, of that experience?
Mhm. Yeah, that's the business we're in. Um, so the I'll start by saying that the kanji for Zen, we learned a few years ago that there's two symbols, two kanji for Zen, and one is basically means insight. So it's like stillness and realization that happens in the heart of Zen practice is zazen, which is sitting meditation, and whatever whatever your listeners practice that allow them to experience something beyond their personality self or their egoic self or their habitual self, whatever that is that allows them to identify as something beyond those boundaries that includes the individual self, but is more and is actually interconnected with all things. Um, in Zen, the practice is stillness meditation. Sometimes in our school, it's called silent illumination. And so like you said, the realization can't be put in words. And so the first kanji is insight, but the second is manifestation. And so this tradition really emphasizes that both are not only important, but what we are. There's a part of us that is beyond words, always has been, is um, timeless, unknowable, unconditioned, infinite, vast, um, intimate. We can never properly put it into words, but those are some of the flavors. And then there's the way that we do the next thing and say the next word, and the whole kind of amazing, enlivening impossibility of life and of Zen practice is how do we express what can't be put into words? And the Tao Te Ching starts by famously saying the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. And yet then the author, who is, it's a bit of a mystery who wrote the Tao Te Ching, but the author goes on and on and on about the Tao. And so of
Yeah.
course and that's what I say to my poetry students. The business of poetry is trying to say something that's very subtle or that's very slippery, and trying anyway, knowing we'll fail at exactly, we can't capture the thing, but we can find words that are close to it and that evoke it and transmit it. And it's fun to play with failing at that. Like Samuel Beckett said, fail, fail better, fail again. And so form and formlessness, I mean, what we always begin with in Zen, and some people say that Zen starts with the destination, that the ground and the fruit are the same, or the beginning and like we already are what we're seeking, and that the there's no technique in Zazen except to recognize that which has always already been free in us. And so there's a lot of forms of meditation that are really wonderful and that are about developing a trait like loving kindness, or it doesn't have to be developing something. It could be remembering a trait,
Mm.
cultivating a state of mind like compassion or equanimity. I'm teaching a class right now on the four immeasurables, which are loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. So those are states we train, but that's different than Zen meditation. Is There's nothing we're training. We're recognizing our own innate Buddha nature, which is already in everything, as everything. That's the recognition. And it's so obvious sometimes that it's it's almost like a joke. Like, how did I ever miss it? It's right here. It's right here. It's right
Yeah.
inside the laughter.
Yeah.
It's literally what everything is made of. The Heart Sutra says form is not other than emptiness, emptiness no other than form. Form is
Mm.
exactly emptiness, emptiness exactly form. Sensation, conception, discrimination, awareness are likewise like this. It goes on and on, basically saying everything is made of awakeness. We literally can't not be it. But we just often are so busy. We're so focused on form because it's so intoxicating, these
Mm.
bodies and biological creatures, that we not only want to survive, but we have this evolutionary drive that's like it's before and beyond any thought about it. Like we just have a reflexive desire for survival. So I'll just say my internet dropped out mid-sentence. And so as you can see, I'm in a new location. Ta-da!
Yeah.
I'm downtown Boulder in my husband's office because our internet at home is being really unstable. And so here I am.
Great. It's great to have you back magically in a different location.
Yeah. I can try to remember where I was if you want.
Yeah, give it a go. We'll see where it takes us. Absolutely.
So you had asked about working with form and formlessness in meditation. And I remember I was trying to express the point that in Zen training, the teaching is always, and the instruction, the invitation is always to simply realize what's right here now. And this awake Buddha nature or timeless openness, boundless emptiness, that's so what we can't help but be, and that is all form, is formless and is all form. And that's so obvious in certain moments and so simple. It's so simple that it's the easiest thing to miss. And then I was trying to make the point that we tend to be really fascinated and intoxicated with form, not because we're bad or anything, but because we're biological creatures that want to survive. And not only do we want to survive, it's not like a thing we've decided we want. It's like so many thousands of years of evolutionary grooming to have us have these reflexes to want to survive. So of course we're tracking other forms, other beings, other people that could be threats or that could um, bring us, it's like what we don't want and what we want are the two basic moves in response to reality as it's unfolding. And something in us is really on guard to survive. And so, with that as the context, how in the world are we going to turn our own light inward as the tradition instructs and do nothing but put our attention on attention itself? That's a really counterintuitive move to a being that is compelled to survive and wants to track form in order to do so.
Mhm.
Um, so it's a there's a tension in that. I've got the little
I
Zoom
love that.
thumbs
That's
up.
great. Yeah. Good job.
There's a tension in there, but also what we see as we organize our form, the form of this body itself. And there's a beautiful way of organizing the body in Zen practice, and then engaging the breath in a really natural way to harmonize body and mind, or to recognize that body and mind are one. And then once we organize the form, the subtle gesture of meditation is to, like I was saying, turn our attention to attention itself, or to awareness itself, or to something that has no name, and just simply be curious about what's perceiving and experiencing this moment as it is. And in that way, then form and formless are just both here. They're not separate. It's one seamless whole that has different kind of dimensionality, but is not separate at all.
Absolutely. I was taken back to my own practice that I've let slip for some years now, but it was that's a really good description of that difference of how we. I was about to say relate to form and formlessness, but even that feels a little bit too descriptive. And I wanted to sort of take us a little bit along a path of in your in the work that you do. I use the word teaching, but perhaps that's not quite how you experience it or would describe it.
Mm.
But just for the purpose of the question, in I sort of see your teaching in meditation and Zen practice. It's very much within form and um, how we show up and are in our bodies in the middle of meditation. You know, where we've got a cramp, we're itching, we sneeze, you know, our mental state shifts all the time, and it's much more explicitly names and talks about formlessness as much as you can. So there's the sort of more explicitly working and teaching within formlessness space. And then the poetry work that you do and the workshops around that side is you're having people sort of bring into form and into words that which is true for them or which is alive for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, I'm actually forming the question as I speak. So I'm wondering how first you experience that as the teacher within that role,
Mm.
how that's different in poetry. What's unique about who you are when you're teaching
Mm.
poetry versus when you're doing the meditation?
Mm. Mm-hmm. Well, I love that. I love how you just embodied like the place I hang out as a poet, as a teacher, as a meditator is exactly that threshold where you were like, I'm forming the question as I speak it. And that's exactly the place where in any role I'm my attention is drawn, is the threshold between form and formless, and how drawing attention, you know, unhooking it from all the forms in our life, and the, you know, the cars going by, you can probably see the light and the sounds and all the to-do lists that might be flashing through our minds, and you know, all the tangible forms and also the subtle forms, the sensations and thoughts and everything. Meditation is like practicing first unhooking from those to touch and realize that awareness is permeating everything. There's a chant in our Zen morning service that says, Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here and now. So it's unhooking to realize the formless is everywhere and nowhere. And then to realize all form is an expression and is manifesting as and inside of and not separate from that. So it's kind of just like unhooking and then re-inhabiting form from a different angle where I'm not caught in ego so much, maybe we could say. And that cycle is just, I feel like depending on what the context, if I'm in a Zen student or teacher role, I'm just practicing unhooking and then re-inhabiting all things as openly and freely as possible. And then when I'm when I'm writing poetry or teaching that, I'm focusing more on well, I always have people start, and I always start with listening. So it's the same gesture as meditation, really. So it's kind of the same
Nice.
thing.
Mm.
And we always have a half hour of meditation before I teach a poetry workshop. And usually my experience when I sit down to write is, even if it's a split second, it's stopping and listening and then expressing. But it's that same cycle of like unhooking from phenomena and then re-engaging and expressing and voicing. And maybe I'll pause. Does that start to answer your question, or do you want to like double click on anything in there?
Yes. Oh, so many that I could, but yeah, I really like how it sounds like that it could be the way in which you do it or the move that you make might be slightly different from one to the other, but inherently they're both existing and living in the same space, and that you kind of, I can see you weave in the two together and they kind of inform each other, the two roles or the ways that you're being when you're leading a meditation versus when you're leading a poetry workshop or something like that. So I really like that. And I'm particularly curious. So for me, my own experience, if I was to try to frame it explicitly for myself, and I haven't done this very often, but I would have tended to be more naturally be able to just fall into that stillness, um, receiving experience in some sense, but then it can also obviously come from inward
Mm-hmm.
and move outward in meditation. But I guess maybe a way of being that's been always more natural to me. Um,
Yeah.
and when I was younger, I remember, I think it was in English classes in high school or in moments where, some adults might have talked about poetry or something. Reading in general and poetry used to mystify me. It was a combination
Yeah.
of being mystified and being confused and therefore just not open to that. And I would always,
Right. Mm.
yeah. And then in probably more recently, maybe the last 5 years, I was introduced to poetry again, through people who would read me poems that would do something to my consciousness and my body that
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't quite describe. And so I've become more curious about this other side, which is the poetry and in some way expression in more of a purposeful way at times. And I'm loving it. I'm finding it fascinating and humbling. And the question that I have is, well, I have one more sort of facet to add, which is one of your poems in Bury the Seed, Poems for Releasing More Life into You, um, has one extremely short poem, um,
Mm.
and it's called Instructions to the Mother Rider.
Yes. I think I have it memorized, but just to be sure, I'm pulling it up. Um, yeah, this one always makes me giggle, but it's also tender. Um, I teach a writing class particularly for mothers who to kind of rewire any of us who are really busy tending to others to realize that we can still access our creativity within that and that it can be really nourishing even if we think we're too busy or too tired, we can do it. And this is just a poem that came to me one day and it made me giggle and I found it useful for myself, so I shared it in this book. It's called Instructions to the Mother Writer. Keep it short, tell the truth, nothing fancy. Yeah.
It's so short. It's so, for me, it struck something. I found it really profound. And for you, what does that bring up when you reread it? Actually,
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know why it's tender for me too, because I think it gets to this, it touches on this, how easily our creativity can be ignored. And yet, and so this poem is kind of saying like, don't ignore it, like just keep it short, just tell the truth, nothing fancy. And Elizabeth Gilbert says, in I think in her book Big Magic, she says, done is better than good. And I think about that a lot. Like both of my books feel not done. There's things I would still change. Every poem feels kind of like a process, but like I
Hmm.
get it to a in its process where I'm like, good enough. And then it's,
Yeah.
sometimes it feels like it lands with a ka-chunk, and other times it's like, well, this is where it's gonna just be declared complete for now.
Mm.
So nothing fancy. It's like, yeah, I love the poems that other people write that I feel like it just came straight out of them and they didn't try to impress me. They're not trying to be fancy. They're trying to tell the truth from their perspective. I think it's Galway Kinnell is the late great Irish American poet. He said something about that poetry is basically a human being standing up, so to speak, and saying what it's like for them to be alive on Earth right now. Just like this is what it's
Yeah.
like from a really honest, uncensored, and unpretentious place. And that's the thing that moves me so much in teaching poetry is people show up with whatever they've got going on, myself included, trying to be a good teacher, trying to have something of value, trying to whatever we all
Mm.
feed with. And slowly through the meditation and the writing and the poetry, and eventually there's tears, and it's like everybody starts to soften, and then they start to write things that they're like, it's like they kind of give up, and then they just say something true, and then they say it out loud, and everyone's like, oh my God, that's so fucking beautiful because it's just honest. And that's my definition of poetry. There's a lot of definitions of poetry, but for me, it's truthful, living language, meaning it came from
Mm.
a place that was real. And when we hear something that's real, we feel that, and we get this injection of truthfulness and aliveness. And I think that's what you were talking about feeling, is that like some poems literally have like a vibrating signature, energetic signature. And when we read them, there's something contagious about the mind state that the poet was in, and then what we experience. It's like in dance performance studies, it's called empathetic kinesthetic awareness. It's like we feel each other. The simple way of saying that is we feel each other. And when someone writes a poem that's true, we feel it. And then we're like, have permission to be more just who we are. So,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. And I think just those three lines, it's like a quick little shortcut, like keep it short, tell the truth, nothing fancy. And if I start from that place, sometimes I end up sometimes I don't keep it short then. It's like it's a way for me to get started because it takes the pressure off. And then sometimes it gets longer and sometimes it is fancy. But like those three lines help me get started.
Yes. Yeah. And so I wanted to hear that from you first, and I think that resonates so much for me as well. I recently, I would say for the last year or so, I've found myself like the sort of the polar opposite of just that release where you can cry and laugh and drop things and just be like, yes, that's just simple. It's true. It's real for you, whatever that is. And I've been more in a sort of like a wound up, you
Mm.
know, stress induced sort of distraction, sort of zoned out space, which has um, been very unpleasant in many ways. And I'm
Mhm.
also conscious of just, transitions and changes. And then it's funny because in preparing for having this conversation with you, I picked up one of your um, books of poetry again, which I haven't read in some time. And I had just successive experiences in just reading those poems because they happen to speak to me. The style that you use and how you write poetry is, again, I struggle to find words for it, but all I know is it releases something in me that I didn't even realize I was holding often. And
Mm.
so I actually want to just deeply share gratitude for what your work opens up and allows for me, because it's I can think myself into circles to try to, figure out what's happening in life, and sometimes it's returning to the ocean and going for a swim, or speaking with a close friend, and sometimes it's reading something like one of your poems where it can be an unlock and a release. And
Mm.
I was so grateful for when that happened. I remember going, how do I even have a conversation with Brooke? The space that you um, seem to be able to tap into and inhabit when you write your work. And
Mm.
I feel a million miles away from that kind of a space at the moment. And it was amazing in reading a few of the poems that did that. So I wanted to say that first. And maybe I'm speaking on behalf of.
I just want to thank you for, I want to thank you
Mm,
for being vulnerable or whatever we might call it, and expressing that
yeah.
gratitude.
Mm,
I really receive it. It really lands in my heart. So thank you.
yeah. 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 Um, and to then return to um, that polarity or that dynamic between formlessness and form, meditation and poetry, and that particular poem. And it talks about to keep it short, to tell the truth, nothing fancy. Expressing things truthfully and simply, um,
Hmm.
I'll speak for myself first, is not easy a lot of the
Hmm.
time. And
Yeah, I
I
agree.
imagine that might be the same for some other people that are in some of your classes or even listening to this. And yet, it's at ground who we are is, perhaps you could say, very simple. And
Mhm.
yet the expression of it, at least for myself, I sometimes find that one of the hardest practices in life for me. I can sit back in at least one dimension of that formlessness and meditation. It's definitely not all about that,
Yeah.
but I can fall into that quite readily. But it's the coming into form and the expression with truth and simplicity that I actually find
Mhm.
super challenging. And I wonder if whether yourself or your students have had that experience, and if you could talk to that a little bit.
Mhm. I'm having this flash. I think it was, who was it? Annie, famous singer, in one of her songs says, "Dying is easy. It's living that scares us to death," or
Yeah,
something. I
yeah,
remember hearing that as a teenager and being like, you know, just kind of dramatically like, "Oh my God, that's so true." But there's something in what you're saying
mm,
about like resting in formlessness. It is a place on the path of awakening or integration or becoming human, however we want to frame it, that a lot of people will get stuck in. Like, some people are stuck in form, and some people get stuck in formlessness because it's really nice there. It's really nice right here, just with infinite space and no need to do anything. Everything's fine. That's true. And so I hear you that it's the move, it can feel like a move back into form. Really, it's both are right here. But yes, that's, to answer your question, that's a very difficult threshold for, I mean, my whole childhood, like I said, I was like, oh, frozen, and adults
mm.
would talk to me and I'd be like, ah. So
Yeah,
I think it's really funny that now I love teaching and I don't mind public speaking. And it's very bizarre because I used to feel very frozen at that edge, and a lot of students in my classes feel frozen there in some way. And I think one of the one of the ways to think about it is that if it's just this big well, for creativity and for writing, it can feel overwhelming to just start. And so there's an expression that creativity loves limits. So that's part of what my job is as a teacher and facilitator of creative writing, we could say, is to give limits and containers. So I use meditation and reading poetry and talking about poetry and discussions as a way to kind of warm everybody up to get
Hmm.
their hearts online, get their bodies settled, get the interpersonal energy flowing. So there's kind of a warm up and a tenderizing through those means. And then I give prompts and limits of time. So it's like you have 12 minutes. There's no rush, but for 12 minutes, just write about, like, for example, this past Wednesday, I read a poem called Sunday by this poet, January Gill O'Neill, and she's speaking to the day Sunday. It's an amazing poem. It's really playful. So I said, you guys now write a poem called Wednesday, because it was Wednesday when I taught. Speak to Wednesday. What do you have to say to Wednesday? What is it about Wednesday that has a cyclical quality? What is it about this Wednesday that's never again? And ask Wednesday questions, speak to Wednesday and say, you are. And so it's this like very particular, limited problem, we could say. And creativity and art love tension. So if we give ourselves a limit, then we go in there and it's like flow starts to happen. People came up with amazing poems. And sometimes toward the end of class, I'll say, okay, now you have 4 minutes to write about this thing. Don't think about it, go. And they produce things that they never would just sitting alone, like, what should I write
Yes.
about?
Yes.
And so a lot of it is having the community and the containers and the limits to kind of get in and just start to flow inside of. Um, and that can kind of ease the movement across that threshold from silence and formlessness to words and form. It takes the preciousness away. Like, we don't have to write a fucking masterpiece every
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
Just
yeah, yeah.
keep it short, tell the truth, nothing fancy. Just get started and see what happens. And the more
Yes.
we practice that, the more fun it is. And then it's like,
Mm.
it's intrinsically rewarding. And it's not even about writing a good poem or getting appreciation from anyone who ever reads it. It's just that it's fun.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or
I
it's
like that.
it's
Yeah.
fun. It's intrinsically rewarding somehow. Like something
Mm.
gets exercised and expressed that just feels natural and good. There's
Yeah.
a term, autotelic, that I learned in grad school that I really like. It's like auto is self and telos is purpose. So it's like it has its own purpose in the process of doing it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. There's that constraints and a container as well as community. I really like that because um I it's fair to say that I sort of grew up with the with openness and acceptance and everything is okay and there's no very little rules and very little boundaries, which can be beautiful. And yet within that, like the way that you just embodied it with your expression, but also described it of if you're just sitting back and just letting things come and waiting for things to sort of arrive, that can be very it can be disorienting. It can be
Yeah.
you can stay lost in that. And there's something about boundaries that are beautiful and the constraints that can actually help that creativity come out.
Yeah.
It's reminding me of I was listening to another podcast interview that you did. It might have been several years ago now. It was before you had released Bury the Seed, and it
Mm.
was with a couple who I think they would
Oh
run
yeah.
Feldenkrais sessions as
Mhm.
part of support for meditation, which I think is such a great idea.
Yeah.
Um, and you shared an experience that you had during meditation. I think they were in the space as well, and the a seed of inspiration or something that came through you or to you
Hmm.
around
Hmm.
needing to return to writing. Um,
Hmm.
and I have a bit of a sort of a path to move us through after that, but I'd love if you just wanted to share that story briefly with people.
Sure. Yeah. So that's Carl and Aaron Rabke. They live in Salt Lake City, Utah. They have an amazing podcast called Embodiment Matters, and they're good friends and beautiful people. And the way I met them was on Zen retreat training with my teacher, Diane Musho Hamilton, and they used to come and lead Feldenkrais during our Zen retreats. And I had, like I said, I started writing when I was like 8, and I kept writing poetry through middle school, high school, majored in it in college, put it down for a while in my 20s while I was dancing professionally. And then, yeah, all the way into this point that I'm going to talk about. So in my 30s, um, I think I'd had my first baby even, but so I was doing Feldenkrais, which is very resourcing and often horizontal and very like, I get into a dreamlike state.
Mhm.
And they read poetry throughout their Feldenkrais lessons, and they read really good poetry that's very inspiring and accessible and beautiful. And it's kind of embarrassing to admit, but the honest experience was like they read a poem. I think Aaron read a poem, and I had this feeling go through me like, I can do that. It was like this thing was like, wait, I know how to do that. I want to do that. I remember that I used to do that, and it was this feeling like that's kind of what I'm here on earth to do in a certain way, to. And I thought of one of my favorite poets is Billy Collins. He's one of the few poets whose work makes me laugh out loud sometimes. He can be really funny in his work. And he said in an interview once that so it was something about like he'd get jealous of other poets who'd written a really good poem, and he'd be like, damn it, why didn't I think of that? Well, and so he'd get into this like kind of jealous competitive spirit, but he'd use that to get himself to write like, well, fuck it, I'm gonna try, sorry for the language. So I had a bit of that, like, oh, that's a beautiful poem. Wait, I can do that. I gotta get back to it. And
Mm.
it inspired me to just start writing again. And that and giving birth to my first son was like a total psycho-spiritual rewiring of my body and my subtle body. And I had this whole experience of like an opening that allowed this creative inspiration to come through. That's a kind of a different story, but they feel related. I think they were around the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's what you mentioned in the other interview as well.
Yeah.
Um, pardon me. It's funny that I had a similar-ish sort of moment of just being pulled out of sleep. Actually, I think it was at 2 a.m. It was similar-ish time. I think it was 2:20, 2020, 2021. And uh, it was 2 a.m. and I was pulled out, like just something around like to actually start a podcast, which in many ways is a
Oh.
little bit silly. It's a bit crazy. There's so many of them out there, but I was reading work by um, David White. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Mhm.
Writes poetry, and yourself. And I was in the midst of, I think I was career-wise wanting to have a bit of a change and be inspired and creative, and had a sudden moment of needing to wake up, and like the name came to me, everything came to me, and I was like, fine, I'll actually write it down before I forget, because otherwise I won't be able to
Yeah,
sleep. Okay,
totally.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a beautiful inspiration moment of inspiration. Thank God for editing. I can get rid of all my coughs. Um, However, the that difference of what can sometimes happen, where there can be this upswell or this download, people might describe it, or a
Hmm.
rush of inspiration, that can happen. And then there's other times where I think you spoke in this interview about, perhaps with your second, uh, maybe your first and your second book of poetry, of sometimes seeking and trying to find that next poem, and then just being sort of, um, shown that, well, that's actually not going to happen today or at this moment. And that push and pull between seeking something, whether that's inspiration for creativity and writing or whatever it might be, and then letting go
Mm-hmm.
through choice or because life just wants that to happen. And I'd be curious to hear how that seeking and letting go um, shows up in your teaching in
Mm-hmm.
whichever form.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel really lucky because so much of my training in Zen, and even before Zen, I had a teacher in San Francisco named Dorothy Hunt, who was my first spiritual teacher. And so much of my training, and I think even in the arts and dance and poetry earlier on, has been training in letting go, letting go, letting go, letting go. And even tracking, you know, a certain kind of meditation is basically tracking when do thoughts or sensations or sensory experiences dissolve into silence, like really closely tracking that. And there's a practice where you can note internally gone, like when a sound is finally in silence, gone, or like I have a thought and then gone, and just watching like where is, if I put my attention on where things are dissolving away into, it can bring me into an experience of what we've been saying, formlessness, or in Sanskrit it's called shunyata, which
Mm-hmm.
also translates as boundlessness. Has a link etymologically with the word swollen, almost like a swollen pregnantness. So there's a quality of emptiness doesn't quite capture it. It's like a boundless in infinity that's full of possibility. Um, and by noting things dissolving and practicing letting go consciously, we can have an experience of formlessness. In creativity, the training was to track emergence. So it's kind of the opposite of like one of my professors in graduate school. I went to graduate school for dance, and I took this amazing course in the religious studies program that was about dance and religion and culture. And he used the word incipience a lot, that dance is this like movement out of nothing, and that's called incipience. It's nothing to something. People often use the word now emergence. So it's kind of like the Zen training really focused on impermanence and the letting go and dissolution side, and then creative practice was always like what words are coming or what movement is coming. I mean, and that's just a life thing too. All of this is just human stuff, like walking down the street and going to order a sandwich for lunch. We're letting go and giving birth to new phenomena. It's all just happening. But these two disciplines train attention to notice both, like formlessness and form. And I lost track of the question. What was the original question?
I'm wondering if I had like a formed question at all.
You
Um,
did. What was it? It
I
was
think it
like,
was that the interplay, the dynamic between seeking and
uh-huh.
letting go. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So the only other thing I'll say before volleying back to you is yeah, this was my first book, and it came in like an I use this word eros as like life force. Like it was this like rising up after giving birth to my son. I got this insight that I needed to write a book, and so I was getting up at 4 or 5 every day and writing poems, and it felt like this life force that I couldn't control, and it was so fun. It was like a love affair to make this book. And I I think I naively thought it would always be that way. So then I went to try to write this book, and I had two kids then. And I was like, well, now I have no time or energy. A lot of the poems in here are about exhaustion and collapse, both in myself, and there's one about called Funeral for the Future, which is about climate collapse and climate grief. Um, and yeah, I just had to grapple with a lot of disappointment because I wanted the experience of the first one of all this like inspiration and, like you said, upswell. And that's just not what was happening. So I was really seeking and grasping, and I had to really get familiar with, like, I know I don't, there's nothing coming today.
Mm.
But the good news is I feel like I learned through that I tell my students now, that's okay. Then if you sit down to write something and nothing comes, you're meditating. That's what that is. Going to the blank page and sitting at that threshold of not knowing. If nothing comes, you're still meditating. So I just kind of put the practice, I mean, I do meditate, but then I let the practices really blur and blend. So if
Mm.
something comes, participate with that emergence. If no form comes, participate with being formless for a while and the relief of that. Um,
Nice.
and like I think we said before we started recording, we can't fight reality. We have t-shirts in our Zen community that say reality rules. I mean, we can participate with it and have
Yeah.
intentions and work toward what we value, of course, more
Yeah.
justice, that kind of thing. But in the beginning and the end of the story is that reality rules, and surrender, even while we're trying to make change, is a wise move.
Yeah. Yeah.
In
Um,
my experience.
I was just playing in my mind of which way to take us next. And I've decided, I thought if there was another poem that um, one of yours that you've written, that you feel particularly moved or is alive for you at the moment that you would like to read, that would be
Hmm.
beautiful. I was about to say whether there's another poem that you've recently read or heard, but I think perhaps we'll
Hmm.
stay with one of yours.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want to find one and read it to us, that'd be really nice.
Yeah. Um, there's two that are coming to mind. One is the one I just mentioned, which is Funeral for a Future, and then there's another one called Break. I wonder if you know them or if you have a preference.
Funeral for the Future, I'm familiar with. Break doesn't immediately come to mind, so I'm a bit more curious about that one.
Okay, great. Well, so I remember really clearly writing this poem, Break, is in my second book, which I was just describing, having it came more in fits and starts. And I really remember the day that I wrote this because I mean the whole thing, I was tired. I was a tired mother of two. So
Yeah.
that day I was a tired mother of two, and I think my older son was at school and my younger son was napping, and I went and just kind of flopped down into the chair in my bedroom, and I got this feeling like I really want to write a poem. I just want that experience. And luckily I did this thing that I actually offer as a prompt to my students now, which is, don't try to write a good poem. Write the poem you need to hear. Like, what do you need to hear? Or, and this might sound dramatic, but what do you need to say before you die? Sometimes if I ask myself that, it doesn't always feel grim. Sometimes it's something silly for some reason, but just to bring impermanence and mortality to the foreground, it kind of gives a little urgency. Or, like, what do I need to hear? It brings up a wise part of us, usually. Something knows what to say to the tired mother. So I was sitting there not knowing where to start. And then I just said, what do I need to hear? And this came pretty much all in one piece. I edited out one stanza later that's not in it anymore, but I'll read it to you now. It's called Break. Rest now. Let the weight you run from every day now draw you down. Later, there will be time to tend to everything left undone. Now, rest. Fall into your own bones, lying horizontal on this ground. Come into your dark corners. Come into this original nakedness under all the layers. Come where all your losses split you open. Don't rise yet. Rest. Be drawn deeper down into the salt tide of tears. Let grief wash you, then drown you beyond the name you first were given when you reached to touch your own mother's face for the very first time, and she smiled her light down into you. Now reach those same fingers for the face of infinity, so that opening your eyes, you will know the one dreaming you is pleased with you, that everything seen is yourself, and that now is the time to rise wholehearted into the work, aching to be animated by precisely you.
Oof.
Sometimes people want a two-time rule. Do you want to just leave it at one reading, or do you want a second?
Ah, no, let's go with a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Usually people appreciate a second reading.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Second time. Break. Rest now. Let the weight you run from every day now draw you down. Later, there will be time to tend to everything left undone. Now, rest. Fall into your own bones, lying horizontal on this ground. Come into your dark corners. Come into this original nakedness under all the layers. Come where all your losses split you open. Don't rise yet. Rest. Be drawn deeper down into the salt tide of tears. Let grief wash you, then drown you beyond the name you first were given when you reached to touch your own mother's face for the very first time, and she smiled her light down into you. Now reach those same fingers for the face of infinity, so that opening your eyes, you will know the one dreaming you is pleased with you, that everything seen is yourself, and that now is the time to rise wholehearted into the work, aching to be animated by precisely you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's beautiful. It's actually, I hadn't connected the name of the poem, but I think that was one of my favorites
Mm-hmm.
when I first read it. So,
Thank you.
mm. you you spoke just before reading that one about the um, climate emergency and climate grief,
Mhm.
and um, it makes me, it sort of connects for me some of the urgency and um, pull that I felt when I wanted to sort of redirect the name of this podcast and the conversations that I thought were really vital and important to
Mhm.
have, which is the urgency that's happening across the globe, not just environmentally, but politically and socially and relationally for so many people, and some um, tragically more than others, um,
Mhm.
especially at the moment. And that this particular this urgency that it calls us towards, you just, I think at the end of the poem that you just read, um, it talks about sort of actually stepping forward. I don't think those were the exact words, but um, actually bringing forth what's ours to give and to contribute where we can. And it
Mhm.
is similar to one of the other ones that I bookmarked in the same book, Bury the Seed, and it feels like it speaks to a similar thing to me in terms of, it's called In the Ring
Oh, yeah.
in Bury the Seed. Um,
Mhm.
and it finishes by saying, step into the ring,
Mhm.
wakeful, find your spine.
Mhm.
Um, and it just, for me, it sort of calls forth that there's a moment that we are called to, and it's continually evolving and arising. Um,
Mhm.
but especially around the climate urgency and some of those other matters of, it's a moment to step up and to really live as much as possible who we need to be in this moment.
Mhm.
And I'm struggling to find a question around this one, but it's just that that energy, or this moment of um, it requiring something of us. And I think in some way it's not 100% clear what that is. There
Mhm.
feels to be some uncertainty around that,
Yeah.
um, and yet that skill of bringing something from nothing, whether that's words in a poem or um, compassionate action in the world,
Yeah.
is feels so pertinent and powerful at the moment.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that dimension is for you at the moment, sort of where you are now in your work, in your teaching, in your life.
Mhm.
If you could speak to perhaps that impulse or that pull at the moment.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much. It's really, really important, necessary inquiry. And I think even just you presencing these questions of like, well, presencing the suffering that's
Mm,
happening. I mean, in this moment here in the United States, Hurricane Helene has done huge damage to Western North Carolina and a lot of loss of life there. There's really entrenched conflict in the Middle East that's continuing and intensifying. We've got an election coming up in my country, and there's tons of polarization and, frankly, um, just meanness between a lot of people from differing perspectives. So that's the particular moment we're in. But it's all of this has been emerging, and problems have been deepening for a while now. And I think presencing the question of what to do is powerful because there is so much uncertainty. My husband's sister is a climate leader, kind of high up in the ranks, and she's brilliant. And I asked her recently, how do you keep doing your work when you have so many statistics and experiences of we're not doing enough to make the difference we need to? And she said that she puts her attention on things that are making progress. For example, there's a project called 30 by 30 where a lot of big corporations and organizations like Patagonia and stuff are coming together and trying to preserve 30% of the Earth's natural landscapes by 2030. So she presents that as something that gives her energy and gives her hope. And then she said, I try to just keep doing the work and stay unattached and attached to the outcome, keep working as hard as we can, and then stay unattached to the outcome. And I mean, that's a really good Buddhist response. And that is in many ways, I think being able to be in uncertainty together is huge. To sit here and not know. I mean, we can do what we know to do, like we got an electric car and what we can do. And I mean, the crown jewel of Zen practice is it's not, in my experience, in my training with my particular lineage and teacher, it's not enlightenment. It's enlightenment so that we can be available for compassionate action. And so how do we know what's compassionate action? Well, we have to not know until we know. And the point of sitting practice is to empty ourselves out so that we're identified as more than just I want, me. We have our attention more open to just do the next thing we know to do, like bring someone who's suffering a cup of tea or make a donation to the work that's being done in North Carolina right now, just the next thing. And I think you said earlier, like doing our part, like what's mine to do? And then not having compassionate for our own instrument too, like doing what I can do wholeheartedly, and then also being kind to, like, I don't need to burn myself out trying to save the world because I literally can't. And it's not helping anyone for me to push myself into a place where I'm just stressed and therefore irritable and therefore snapping at my kids or whoever. So it's like there's so much good work being done around sustainability for sustainability activists. And I do think that creative practice and contemplative practice are part of that. And also are part of the good work being done around like climate grief and the interior aspect of climate collapse, like not ignoring the feeling states that it brings up in us as humans. Like we need to grieve together what we've done.
Yeah.
And we might not have solutions until we've been rearranged by that wave of grief. We might not be able to see what needs to be done until we've cried for the fact that this might not be a viable planet for our children or our children's children. And the reality of that is, I mean, if it doesn't break our hearts, I don't know what does. And sometimes I don't know what to do, but feel it. But I think it's important for us to feel it together, because it's just the honest thing to do.
Yeah. It's kind of bringing it back to from generation to generation and the passing on, or the the transmitting or the passing on of being human as best as we can, often, very imperfectly, in the face of really difficult, seemingly intractable, uncertain realities, I think it's funny, it's kind of bring it back right to the beginning of where you spoke of the core of it for you is love and freedom and um, living that as best as possible, but also honestly and messily with your family. There's something about, rather than rushing to practical box ticking solutions to feel better temporarily,
Mm-hmm.
and being really fully human in the face of what's occurring, I think that has such a big, um, there's so much value and importance in that, in how we do that, so that we're kind of modeling that for the next generation, but also not rushing to solutions which may actually just cause more
Right.
problems down the
Mm-hmm.
road. And I love how the practices like creativity, um, or reflection inward practices, how they are resources that we can
Mm-hmm.
bring. Um, there's always that bias or tendency towards action,
Mm-hmm.
which absolutely matters at times. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the work that you do and that others sort of within that space do, feels really timely. The irony,
Mm-hmm.
even in moments of urgency,
Mm-hmm.
not forgetting the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a poet philosopher who I really love who's done some guest teaching for some of my courses named Bayo Akomolafe.
Mm-hmm.
He's originally from Nigeria and he teaches all over the world now. And he often shares it's a Nigerian adage that says the times are urgent, we must slow down. And I've heard him talk about it like it's not like the times are urgent, we must slow down and do the same things slower. We must slow down to perceive more clearly,
Mm-hmm.
breathe more deeply, and be transformed ourselves before we take an action that's going to have karmic implications. Doesn't mean we need to be like really precious and freaked out about every move we make, but there's also the point that like actually doing less has less of a carbon imprint. So sometimes just taking a nap might be a kind thing for ourselves and the earth.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Um, your your book, Bury the Seed, it has four parts. Those are bury, tend, harvest, and release.
Mm. Mhm.
And it makes me think of seasons,
Mhm.
and just the natural coming and going of seasons and what each of those bring. And it
Mhm.
also makes me think of sort of where we've come to in the conversation around whether it's expressing in form or resting in formlessness, or moving and seeking or letting go, or um, actually just slowing down as opposed to
Mhm.
rushing into action all the time. Um, it sort of it sort of feels in some way encouraging, or I feel a little bit more of a relaxing and trusting, in that there's so much that's beyond who we feel ourselves to be most of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Um, and what's the right thing to do? What's the wrong thing to do? Who should I be as a teacher in this moment? How can I be a
Mhm.
perfect student? Or um, how do I help save or change the world? But
Mhm.
rather relaxing into seasons which just happen to and around us, I think is such a beautiful reminder. And I love that it's all around us. It's in the temperature, it's in the textures and the colors of
Mhm.
our environment, and the mediums that you teach um, have an amazing way to connect to those aspects. Perhaps you wanted to share what your current offerings are, what your current projects are practically, and where um, where your heart is kind of pulling you in a creative space currently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really relates to what you were just saying. A week ago, I completed a 7-month online program called Feeding Your Genius, Deep Resourcing for Activating Your Gifts. And so it's a program, I co-teach it with Rachel Blackman, my friend who's Australian.
Ah.
And she's a theater artist and Feldenkrais teacher and somatic coach and brilliant, funny human. And so the program starts right before the spring equinox in the Northern Hemisphere. And so it's the whole first half, the first 3 months are workshops and one-on-one coaching that have to do with resourcing. That's it. We're not, if creativity and expression happen, great, but that's not the emphasis. We spend 3.5 months I lead meditation. Rachel leads Feldenkrais and other movement practices that are very resourcing, and we do visualizations and just lots of very resourcing practices. And then we have a midpoint retreat to clarify a specific gift that we want to cultivate over the second half. And then the second half is emphasizing bringing the thing into form, whether it's a new habit, a book, a new business, whatever the thing is, whether it's personal or professional. For the rest of it, it's like activating your gifts from this resourced place. And of course, the two kind of blur throughout, but we just closed it right after the fall equinox. So the whole thing is it's created in harmony with the bigger bodies of the planets and the seasons. And so we just finished, and now we're all kind of going into more restful, darker months. Mm-hmm. So that's something that we're going to open up applications for 2025. It has to do with exactly what you were just speaking about of participating with the seasonal energies and light and resourcing ourselves to be able to activate the gifts that are ours to give. And then besides that, I'm teaching poetry and meditation online, and I have a retreat in Vancouver at the end of October, a meditation retreat with my colleague Lisa Genki Gibson. We have a 7-day retreat in Boulder in January. Mm-hmm. It's a Zen retreat, but with mixed in creativity and aliveness practices. And then the thing that's newest, and so it's maybe most alive in me, and I literally just finished the webpage today, is a retreat in Northern Italy next September. That's all of this. It's meditation and writing in this beautiful little mountain town called Lana, at a hotel called the Schwarzschmied that's part of Design Group hotels, which are like beautifully designed and also have culturally rooted hospitality. So it's this beautiful place with local food used in the restaurant, but we're going to be meditating and writing and out in nature, resting, playing for a whole week in Northern Italy next September 2025. And I'm so excited. It's kind of just like a thing I really want. Like I really want to do. All of my work is that way. I love everything I'm doing, but I want to go to this place. I want to be with people there doing the practices you and I have been talking about. And so that's the thing that's kind of most at the tip of my tongue that I'm really, really excited about.
Oh, that sounds beautiful. My partner, she's from Italy, and
wow.
Northern Italy, actually.
No way.
Yes way, yeah, near Milan. And we might actually be in Italy around that time.
Well,
yes,
I'll keep you in the loop in case you guys want to come.
Please do. Yes. You have your website, which I will include in the show notes for people to be able to find. And
yeah, my personal website. And then I have a Zen website too, which maybe I'll pass that.
Please do, absolutely, so people can find you as well,
Okay.
and more of your work. I feel so grateful to have had this conversation with you. It
Me
was
too.
worth waiting all that time.
I agree. I really enjoyed it. It was worth the year-long wait.
Yes, the year-long wait, absolutely. Um, yeah, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing more of your offerings out there and hearing more of your work. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for just such an authentic exchange today. I really enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, share, and leave a 5-star review on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Your support helps us reach more people and keep exploring the future of learning together. See you next time.